So, today we are going to talk about moral responsibility and alternative possibilities. But in particular, we're going to focus on this principle in the moral responsibility and free will literature called the principle of alternative possibilities. We'll see that below. Sometimes it's called PAP, P-A-P. And also, that's kind of one major half of what we're going to talk about. But we'll also talk about a famous sort of style of objection to this principle that are called Frankfurt style cases, or Frankfurt cases for short. And they come from a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt, who posed this sort of style of example or style of objection to the principle of alternative possibilities. And we'll talk about the structure of that objection. And I say the structure of the objection because there's really just kind of like this way in which you set up the example or the objection to this principle. And it can take various forms, but there's sort of a core structure that it needs to have. And once you get that structure, the thought goes, Harry Frankfurt thought, then what you end up with is a counterexample to the principle of alternative possibilities. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about, this connection between moral responsibility and the possible need for having alternative possibilities, for having the ability to do otherwise. Okay, so now let's first start. Sorry, let me zoom in a little. Let's first start by talking about the connection between moral responsibility and free will. So we've been talking mostly about free will leading up to this section in terms of incompatibilism, compatibilism, and agent causal libertarianism, and these other kinds of views and topics and concepts that we've talked about have mostly been structured in terms of free will. And so I know sometimes I say free will, sometimes I say responsibility. Is the person free and responsible? Sometimes say them together. But what's the connection? This sort of section that we're focusing on, and these chapters, this chapter and the next one that we'll cover in the next lecture from Kane, frames the discussion in terms of responsibility in particular. So let's talk about the relevance of moral responsibility here. So we care, it seems plausible that we care about free will mostly because we care about being morally responsible. So this question of whether our actions can be free really seems to only come up or arise because we care about whether we should blame people or praise them. And mostly, again, it gets talked about mostly in a certain way, namely in terms of blame, wrongdoing. But the same could be said for praise and right doing, I guess. There are some people, Susan Wolf in particular, who think that blameworthiness and praiseworthiness might come apart and have different requirements. But we're going to set that aside for now. But mostly talk in terms of blame. So this question of whether we should blame people, whether our blame is appropriate. So if somebody performs an action that we take to be wrong, we want to know, are they responsible? Should we blame them? Is it appropriate to blame them? Do they deserve blame or maybe even punishment for what they did? Are they morally responsible? Well, that question is sort of at the core. And in order to answer that question, we want to wonder whether they're free. Did they do what they did freely? Was it of their own free will? Right? So this question of free will seems to arise because or on the basis of our interest in whether we should blame people or hold them morally responsible. Right? And so if you just imagine that nobody was responsible for anything that they did. Right? Imagine nobody was responsible. We already knew that nobody was responsible for anything. Nobody's blameworthy. Nobody deserves anything. Nobody's praiseworthy. Would we even really talk about free will? Not that that would mean we wouldn't have it, just that if we already knew no one was responsible for anything, morally responsible for anything, then does it even make sense to talk about free will? Would we even care to talk about free will? If anyone acted freely, did things freely, if we already knew no one was responsible? And it seems like maybe not. And so it seems then that the relevance of responsibility here is that that's the reason why we care about free will, because we think maybe people are responsible. Okay. And it's sort of in this line of thinking that in the literature, most people make claims like this. Many people, I should say, I don't have the data or the numbers in front of me, but many people think, and you just see people say this explicitly, you see just as this is kind of presupposed to make sense of the kinds of things that people say, that moral responsibility requires free will. Okay? That's a very common assumption. If some agent S is going to be morally responsible, then it has to be true that they were free. So S is morally responsible for doing some action A only on the condition that they did that action freely. Okay, so these here are just kind of different ways of saying the same thing, that moral responsibility requires free will, right? So someone is responsible for something only if they did that thing freely or of their own free will. So another way of saying that is, if it's true that some agent is morally responsible for some action, then it also must be true that that agent did that action freely. And to put this in kind of logical terms, or to show kind of more explicitly the conceptual connection or the conceptual relationship between these terms, is that moral responsibility entails free will, or requires free will, or presupposes free will. So moral responsibility is a sufficient condition. It's enough. If you know that someone's responsible, then you know that they're free, which means that free will is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. You cannot be morally responsible unless you're free, right? Only if you're free. Okay, and so this arrow, hopefully we remember from early weeks, the conditional claims, the sort of logical structure of conditional claims. This is the antecedent or sufficient condition. This is the consequent or necessary condition. And this claim here, moral responsibility requires free will, is just saying this. If you're morally responsible, then that means you must have been free. Okay. And therefore, this is just a logical consequence of this, or saying this. What follows from that is, if you don't have free will, right, lacking free will over your action means that you also lack moral responsibility for that action. If it's true that responsibility requires free will, well, then losing free will, this is a not, remember, if you're not free, then that means you're not responsible. Right? Remember dog and mammal, right? If it's true that being a dog requires being a mammal, well, then if you're not a mammal, you can't be a dog, right? So same thing here. If it's true that moral responsibility requires free will, well, then lacking free will means you lack responsibility, okay? So that's the kind of conceptual connection people sort of assume, not necessarily assume, but this is just the standard way in which people think about this. And there's motivations, intuitions, and some case-style arguments for this kind of thing. But that's the idea. And then ultimately, what that means, right? What that means is that anything that undermines free will, okay, if there's something that takes away free will, then that thing will also take away moral responsibility. So if this is true, lacking free will means you lack moral responsibility, well, then whatever it is that takes away free will, if there's something that does that, perhaps determinism, and as we'll see below, perhaps some people think not having the ability to do otherwise, lacking alternatives to your action, maybe that takes away free will. And maybe it's true that if you acted freely, that means you could have done something different. And so if something takes away the ability to do something different, then that's going to take away free will. But if that's true, if this is true up here, then that thing that takes away free will is also going to take away moral responsibility. Okay, so this is kind of like a complex conditional claim here. It basically says, if it's true, so this is the major operator, if it's true that something takes away free will, if determinism entails that we don't have free will, for instance, then determinism also entails that we don't have moral responsibility. It doesn't have to be determinism, it's whatever it is. It's manipulation, or being incompetent, or having some cognitive failure, or being ignorant of some truth, or whatever it is, whatever X is. If X takes away free will, then X also takes away moral responsibility. Why? because lacking free will means you lack responsibility. And so whatever does the work to take away free will is also going to take away moral responsibility, right? You could just go from here to no free will and then shift up here. Well, that means no responsibility. Well, how'd you get that? Well, because moral responsibility requires free will, right? Why? Well, I mean, so far we've seen the motivation is we just don't really care, it seems, about free will, except for insofar as that gets you responsibility, that people can be responsible, right? It's because we think we can blame people sometimes appropriately, that we're justified in blaming people, that people deserve blame. That's why we ask about free will. We want to make sure that the blame is deserved, is appropriate. And one of the central ways in which we first think about making sure that the responsibility is appropriate, deserving, is by saying that the person acted freely, right? And so we care about free will because we think responsibility is important. And that just leads to this common assumption that responsibility just requires being free. And if responsibility requires being free, then lacking free will means you lack responsibility. And then that means whatever it is that takes away free will would also take away responsibility. Okay. And a common justification of this is fairness. It just seems like it's unfair to hold someone responsible if they didn't act freely or if they lack free will. Right? Like if we just stipulate, if we just say, oh yes, John knocked the cup over, but he didn't act freely when he did it. Well, then it would seem unfair to blame him for that. And if you want to say, well, he should have been paying more attention. Sure, maybe he didn't see it and he couldn't help it, but he should have done something to pay more attention. He should have been more careful. It's like, okay, well, then we just push the question back. Did he act freely when he didn't pay attention? Was he negligent freely? So the point is, it seems like it's unfair to hold someone responsible if they're not free. And then that sort of motivates this idea that responsibility requires freedom, because otherwise it would be unfair, right? There is this view called semi-compatibilism, defended by, at least proposed and partially defended by John Fisher. It's sometimes unclear whether he holds this view, but it's at least proposed by him. And semi-compatibilism is the view that at least responsibility is compatible with free will. Maybe not... at least responsibility is compatible with determinism. Remember, determinism is the view that the past guarantees the future. Right? If you have the past and you have deterministic laws of nature, then there's only one possible future. Every future state after that is necessary, is guaranteed. And we've been talking about this question of whether free will is compatible with determinism, whether it's physical laws that determine your actions or God that determine your actions. We've talked about these different things. And the compatibility question was about determinism being compatible with free will. Well, now that we're sort of splitting responsibility apart and talking about that in its own right, there's this other view that I'll just mention, which is that maybe free will is not compatible with determinism. Our actions can't be free in some genuine sense if our actions are determined, but maybe we're still responsible. So you can have responsibility without being free. That's something that John Martin Fisher at least entertains. It's not clear whether he really accepts that, but he says, look, I mean, I'm more sure. He gives some examples. I think that we'll see in a couple weeks. We'll look at his reasons responsiveness account. And in fact, it may even be in the next lecture. But in any case, he has some arguments to try to show that compatibilism is true. And then some people say, well, it just doesn't really seem like there's sufficient control there, or at least not sufficient control to call it free will. And he says, well, fine, maybe it's not free will, but the control that's there is sufficient for responsibility. So there is this view called semi-compatibilism where semi meaning like half, like free will and responsibility are the two main, free will and responsibility are the two main things. He's like, well, I'll get you this one on determinism. I don't know if I can get you this one, but so we're going to ignore that for now because it's kind of counterintuitive to think that you could be responsible without being free. And not many people, I think, are really talking about this or endorsing it. And the main idea is that if you're responsible, even on determinism, well, then you had to control yourself in some way. And Fisher doesn't deny that. He thinks you do control yourself if you're responsible. But some people might not want to call that free will. And he says, okay, well, fine. Then whatever you're talking about is not compatible. Free will is not compatible. But responsibility is. But he's still going to say that responsibility requires a certain amount of control. Right? And so if you don't want to call that free will or whatever, now we're just talking about terms. We're just talking about words. And so it's still the main components of compatibilism are still there. But anyways, we're not going to talk about this too much, or really at all, other than for me just to mention it here as this kind of alternative to this view, to this assumption that responsibility requires free will. There is this kind of rare exception here, but it's not really clear if it really is an exception and just to play on or like a terminological dispute. But in any case, a true semi-compatibilist view would be kind of counterintuitive. And then if it's not really truly semi-compatibilist, then it's not really an alternative view. So just something to think about. All right. Now, this leads, and this kind of has to do with what I was just saying, this idea that responsibility requires free will in some sense, this can lead to a common way of defining free will in the literature, which is just to define free will as the control over an action that is required to make the agent responsible. Okay, whatever control is required. So if you think someone's responsible for some action, morally responsible for some action, blameworthy, deserving of some sort of reactive attitude, whatever that is, if you think someone's responsible, then free will is just what we call the control that they needed to exercise or exhibit in order to be responsible for that. Okay, so just give the name free will to that control that you have to exercise in order to be responsible for an action. We'll just call that free will. Okay, Peter Van Inwagen, who we've talked about a little bit, he does not like this strategy. He thinks this is the wrong way to think about free will. He thinks free will, to sort of put it bluntly and briefly, he thinks free will is an incompatibilist notion. And to say that free will is just whatever control is required for moral responsibility is to kind of get away from that, because it allows people, so these debates here just become about what kind of control is required. So we're not debating about free will anymore, at least not, whether free will is compatible with determinism. We're just debating about what kind of control is required. How do we fill out free will? Right? And so you might just call that responsibility level control. The control required for responsibility. And just call this free will. Free will is just responsibility level control. The control that gets you to the level of being responsible for what you do. And maybe that requires indeterminism. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just requires some certain knowledge. Maybe it just requires being caused in the right way. Maybe that's enough control for responsibility. And so you can see that now determinism, if you think about free will in this way as just responsibility level control, determinism might not really matter. You might not think determinism has to be false in order to be responsible. You might not think you need alternatives or anything like that. And we'll get to this in just a second, actually. But the point here is that Peter Van Inwagen thinks, well, that's just not really free will. Free will is literally the power at one time to do both A and the power to do not A at the same time. Right? Where A and you can't do A and not A together, but you have the power to do either one. And you have that power at one time. So it's not like, I could do A now, and then a few seconds later, now I can do not A. No, at one time, either you could do A or you could not do A. And that power you have to do one of those two things is what he calls free will. Okay. And obviously that builds a lot more into it, and it's a kind of incompatibilist notion. So I want to just note that, but we're just going to set that aside because it's actually really quite common for people to think about free will in this way. Peter Van Inwagen has a paper, I think it's called How to Think About Free Will, where he argues that this is not the way to think about free will. But we're going to set that aside because Most people don't listen to him. Most people actually do think about free will, for better or worse, whether they're wrong or right. They ignore Peter Van Inwagen mostly, and people think about free will in terms of just the control that's required for moral responsibility. So this responsibility level control is just another name for free will, and vice versa. Free will is just another name for responsibility level control. Okay, so that's a common way to think about it. And so you could see this tight connection between free will and moral responsibility. Responsibility level control just is free will. That's what it is. Free will just is whatever control is required for moral responsibility. That's the way people mostly think of it. Okay, so moral responsibility is relevant to the free will discussion because it seems like that's the thing that's really at the source of what we care about. We care about free will because we care about responsibility. And therefore, this is a common assumption, once we start thinking about that responsibility requires free will. You can't get responsibility without having free will. And that's why people talk about free will so much, and what it is, and what's required for it, and the kind of control that it involves, and whether determinism rules it out. Right? Because we want to know if something rules out free will, because that thing is going to rule out what we really care about, moral responsibility. So if something takes away free will, we're going to lose responsibility. And that's really what we care about. And so caring about free will rests on caring about responsibility, and it makes this tight connection. Responsibility requires free will. And so that leads people to define free will in terms of responsibility. Say, what's free will? Oh, it's just the control that you need in order to get responsibility. And then we just argue about what kind of control that is. Okay. Excuse me. Take a drink. All right. So now we can get to, this principle. The principle of alternative possibilities, which is often called PAP, P-A-P. People just say PAP. And then there's this related principle that we'll see. It's called AP. It's at least what Kane calls it in this chapter. And we'll see the connection and why these principles are important. And hopefully it'll become pretty intuitive just based on what we just said. So PAP, I'm going to call it PAP for now because it's just simpler. PAP is the principle that persons are morally responsible for what they do, right, or what they have done, for what they do, only if they could have done otherwise. All right? This is just another way of saying moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. I'm sorry, not requires free will. It's just another way of saying moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Okay? Someone is responsible for what they do only if they could have done otherwise. It's required that they be able to do otherwise. That is PAP. So someone who thinks PAP is true thinks that responsibility requires alternative possibilities. Right? So this principle here, PAP, it just describes or just tells you what's required for responsibility level control. Okay. Responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. And that is just part of what it means for you to control yourself enough to have responsibility. Maybe not all of it, right? Maybe just being able to do otherwise is not sufficient for control. Maybe there's more stuff we need. But being able to do otherwise is basically just describing a requirement for responsibility level control, which again, remember, is just free will. Therefore, free will also requires the ability to do otherwise. And that's just the second principle. Excuse me. All right, so if PAP is the view that responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, can't be responsible unless you could do otherwise, then that really easily leads, given the stuff that we set up here, to the idea that free will requires the ability to do otherwise as well. Requires alternative possibilities. That's why it's called AP, alternative possibilities. Right. So AP is about free will, and PAP, P-A-P, is about responsibility. PAP says responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Alternative possibilities. AP says free will requires the ability to do otherwise. Okay, well, why is this true? Because this is true. And because of the way in which people define free will. Right? This is true. AP is true because free will just is the control needed for responsibility. Free will is just responsibility level control. And if more responsibility requires alternative possibilities, and free will is just the control needed for responsibility, well, then it follows pretty straightforwardly that free will requires alternative possibilities. And what that means is AP, the truth of AP, this thing here, free will requires alternative possibilities. That's true because, at least partly, moral responsibility requires free will. Excuse me, moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Okay, so AP rests on this being true plus the way in which people think about free will. But this kind of gets assumed. People just think, well, free will just is responsibility level control. Right? So then once you have this, you say, okay, well, that control, that responsibility level control, that needs to involve the ability to do otherwise. All right, well, that's PAP. Responsibility, which requires some control, doesn't just require control, it requires the ability to do otherwise. That's part of the control it requires, and that's just PAP. Well, therefore, since free will just is the control you need for responsibility, free will also requires the ability to do otherwise. All right. Okay, so AP rests on PAP, which means, just like above, just like what we did up here with this logical stuff here, if AP rests on, or is true, or is justified in virtue of PAP, if AP is true, well, it's partly because PAP is true. Well, then, again, if PAP is false, then AP will be false. Right? So if you show that this is false, responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, well, then neither does free will, because free will is just the control required for responsibility. It's just responsibility level control. So if responsibility level control, which is free will, does not require the ability to do otherwise, well, then, of course, neither would free will. Right? So why does this matter? This matters because determinism, now what we've been talking about for weeks, this determinism debate and how people try to get around it and everything, determinism is thought to remove free will because it removes alternative possibilities. Right? Determinism says the past and the laws of nature guarantee one future. Okay? At every moment, the future is guaranteed. One future. At every moment, there's only one possible future. Once you have the past, or like the beginning of the universe, right, some initial state of the world, and then you have deterministic laws of nature, that means from every moment forward, there's only one possible future. So if you look at the possibilities of a deterministic world, it's just one straight line, right? Well, that sounds like determinism removes alternative possibilities. You couldn't do otherwise. Right, there's debate about that, but it seems like it removes alternative possibilities. And so determinism is thought to remove free will because it removes alternative possibilities. Sorry. That's why that matters. That's why these principles matter. Now, if AP, this free will requiring alternative possibilities, the ability to do otherwise, if that's false, and we don't need alternative possibilities in order to get free will, right? If this is false, well, then it seems like determinism is no longer a problem. Because determinism was supposed to be a problem because it removed alternative possibilities. Right? But if alternative possibilities don't matter to free will, if this is false, then who cares about determinism, right? Therefore, showing that PAP is false. Remember, AP rests on PAP. Therefore, PAP being false means AP is false. And AP being false means that determinism doesn't matter. And then we can forget about this silly debate, the compatibilists would say. Therefore, this matters, these principles and the connection between responsibility and free will, they matter because showing that this principle is true, showing that this principle is false, showing that moral responsibility does not require alternative possibilities, right? So showing that PAP is false, that would show that determinism doesn't threaten free will, because AP would be false. If PAP is false, AP is false. Okay? If PAP is false, AP is false. Therefore, showing PAP is false shows that AP is false, which would show that determinism doesn't matter. Right? So that's one reason why people argue against PAP, because they think, oh, well, people think free will requires alternative possibilities. Well, that's only because they think moral responsibility requires alternative possibilities. Therefore, if we show that PAP is false, if we show that responsibility does not require alternative possibilities, well, then that shows free will doesn't either, and then we don't have to care about determinism. Right? But also, it would show that determinism doesn't threaten moral responsibility, right? Why? Because free will is just the control that is required for moral responsibility. And free will would be able to exist if AP is false. Right? AP says free will requires the ability to do otherwise. But that's only true if moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Why? Because free will is being understood as just the control needed for responsibility. Now, this connection here is basically saying, look, if you think that moral responsibility and free will are really tightly connected, and more specifically, if you think moral responsibility requires this freedom level control, if you just think free will is just whatever control is required from responsibility, right? Free will is just responsibility level control. If you have that really tight connection between free will and responsibility, well then these other things seem to go together as well. So PAP is going to be the support for AP. If free will is understood in terms of responsibility, then free will requires alternate possibilities only because moral responsibility is supposed to. And that gets you this here. Right? So objecting to PAP, as we'll see below, Frankfurt and then other people after him tried to show that PAP is false. They don't like this. They don't like responsibility requiring the ability to do otherwise. They're like, no, you can be responsible even if you can't do otherwise. And we'll see why they think that. But the reason they attack PAP is so that they can attack the AP. They can attack AP. They can attack the idea that the control you need requires alternative possibilities. They think, no, you can have sufficient control over your actions even if you can't do otherwise. And that's this. And the way to attack that is to attack this. Why would they want to attack that? Because they want to stop worrying about determinism. Well, they're not really worried about it. They want other people to stop worrying about it. The determinism debate, the compatibilism debate, it's like, hey, determinism seems really bad. Why? Well, because it takes away alternative possibilities. Well, why does that matter? Because free will requires alternative possibilities. Well, why does that matter? Because free will is just the control you need for responsibility. And responsibility requires alternative possibilities. And so if we attack this, we can get ourselves to stop worrying about determinism, stop worrying about whether or not we have alternative possibilities, and just focus on the control that we need in order to say that someone is responsible without having to talk anything about the ability to do otherwise. That's the goal. Okay, now let's look at a picture that's supposed to represent these ideas. This is just representing this and this together, and we'll move to the second one, are supposed to represent basically the first page that we just went over. All right, so this side here is the initial setup. This is all kind of basically this stuff. Here, this connection, right? So think of this as like kind of a balancing act here. But the stuff on the top is resting on this stuff. It needs this stuff underneath it to survive. Okay, that's what the down arrows mean. This rests on this, requires this, has as its foundation or its ground this, and same here and here and here, right? That's the idea anyways. So again, people define people define free will in terms of responsibility. So they say free will is just the control that's required for responsibility, right? So you can't be responsible unless you have free will, a certain level of control. And that's just the definition of responsibility, right? You need free will in order to be responsible. Another way to say that, again, is you need some level of control. Free will is just responsibility level control. And it's down below it because it's needed. You need this for that. If you knock this out, this is going to fall over. Okay, as you can see over here, which we'll get to. Now, PAP is just the view. Again, PAP just says moral responsibility requires alternative possibilities. That's what we just saw above, PAP. You can't be responsible unless you have alternative possibilities. Knock this out, no alternative possibilities, then you're going to knock this out because this is holding them together. PAP. Okay. Now, once you get PAP, responsibility requires alternative possibilities, and free will is just the control that's also required for responsibility. Well, it seems like free will then, the control that you need, is going to require alternative possibilities. Right? And that's why AP rests on PAP. So if you look, this is blue, this is red, and this is purple. So you put these together, blue and red, and you get AP. If you have this definition of responsibility where it requires free will, it requires some level of control that we just call free will, but you also think that responsibility requires alternative possibilities, well, then it just seems, just put those together. It just seems like what you're saying is free will, the control that you need for responsibility, requires alternative possibilities. Okay. But some people think alternative possibilities require determinism to be false. It requires indeterminism. And they do that by just saying, look, that's just what it means to have the ability to do otherwise. It means you can't be determined. You have to have some open future in front of you. And again, we talked a little bit about classical compatibilists and the conditional analysis. We're going to set that aside for now. Okay. Just the idea here is just that alternative possibilities requires indeterminism. Okay. And so responsibility, if that requires free will and that requires alternative possibilities, and so free will also requires alternative possibilities, and alternative possibilities requires indeterminism, then now you can see this debate, the compatibilism debate, why it matters that these are all connected the way they are. Because then it looks like now you need indeterminism to be true in order to get responsibility, and thus in order to get free will, or the other way around, in order to get free will, and thus in order to get responsibility. That's the initial setup. This is a common way, these connections here, it's a common way to think about responsibility. This is very, very common, thinking that responsibility requires free will. And then these here are the sort of common, sort of intuitive ways in which people have thought about responsibility, that it requires alternative possibilities, but that's what we're going to see get sort of objected to today. We're going to see pushback against this. Now, why does this matter? Again, this is the why this matters part. Because then determinism destroys everything. If you have indeterminism here at the bottom, because indeterminism is needed in order to have different possibilities, open future, well, then once you get determinism coming in, it blows up indeterminism, obviously, which blows up the ability to do otherwise. Determinism coming in destroys the alternative possibilities. It destroys the ability to do otherwise. And since those were connected to here, that's going to trickle up and destroy free will, which is also going to destroy moral responsibility. Okay. The reason is just that they're tied. They're tied together. If you tie them together, moral responsibility requires alternative possibilities, and that requires indeterminism, then determinism can come in and destroy this whole thing and flip everything on its head. All right. Now, what we're going to see is that Harry Frankfurt and other people try to sever these ties. They try to say, no, PAP is false. Moral responsibility does not require alternative possibilities. And really, less explicitly, but really another thing that they're saying is free will, understood as the control that you need for responsibility, also does not require alternative possibilities. That's why the Frankfurt cases are supposed to work, is because the person in them exercises enough control. That's the thought, anyways. They exercise enough control in order to be responsible. So they still have what we would call free will. They have enough control for responsibility. and they're responsible. The judgment about the agent in the case is that they're responsible, but it rests on the idea that they exercised enough control. So you get to keep this connection, but you sever this link. Basically, you sever the link between responsibility and freedom and alternative possibilities. The idea is that Frankfurt cases are supposed to show that you don't need this stuff down here. And if you think that indeterminism is required for alternative possibilities, then you're not going to need that either. So you just get rid of this stuff down here. You get rid of the connection, right? You say, this stuff, and this in particular, it just isn't required for this stuff. We can sever these ties. And what does that do? Well, it keeps determinism from blowing all this stuff up because we've cut these ties now. And the explosion is not going to trickle up anymore because these no longer rest on these. So determinism is no longer a threat to free will and responsibility because we've severed the ties here. Determinism can take away alternative possibilities. It means you don't have other things you could have done, at least not in a certain robust or important sense. Okay, but that's okay because responsibility and free will, the control required for responsibility, do not require alternative possibilities. That is at least what the Frankfurt cases are supposed to show. And a short way of saying that is they're supposed to show that PAP is false because PAP is just this connection. Okay. Now you might have this question, well, if alternative possibilities are not sort of grounding or being the foundation for responsibility and free will, well, then what is? Maybe something else needs to be. And you're right. There needs to be something else that grounds control. What makes it that a person exercises enough control in order to say that they're responsible? Right? So if responsibility still requires a certain amount of control, what do we need for this control? If we don't need alternative possibilities, what do we need? And that's where compatibilists come in, and then that's what we'll see in the next lecture. People filling in this, what do they say? Kane calls them new compatibilists, and what he means by that is they're not these classical compatibilists that try to keep this, but in a different way with the conditional analysis. They try to say other things like, well, in order to exercise control, enough control to be responsible, you can just be caused in the right way as long as your action comes from a certain kind of mechanism, psychological mechanism, or as long as your action is caused by your reasons and motivations and so on, and as long as those reasons and motivations are like structured in the right way. Those are the kinds of things they're going to say, and roughly it's going to come to being caused in the right way, really. There's a few different alternatives, like having your action just reflect who you are in the right way, and maybe not having to be caused by it. But the main point to keep in mind here is this was the initial setup, having all these connections between responsibility and free will, and then between those two things and alternative possibilities. And that leads to this sensitivity to determinism. Determinism can come and blow everything up. But if we're able to cut these ties here and say that responsibility and free will don't require the ability to do otherwise, well, then determinism doesn't pose such a big problem anymore. Okay, maybe we have a little bit of another problem. We have to try to say how you get control in a way that's enough for responsibility without the ability to do otherwise, and we'll get into that. But at the very least, we do kind of, hopefully we can see how severing these ties, showing that PAP is false and showing that AP is false, kind of protects us from determinism. That's the idea anyways. All right, so why do people reject PAP? How do they do that? Right, so again, this is what we're going to focus on today. Rejecting PAP by using the Frankfurt cases. All right. So, but let's start with an initial reason. Not a Frankfurt case, just kind of an initial reason. And Kane describes this Dennett sort of position, Daniel Dennett, who's a compatibilist, and he uses the kind of famous case of Martin Luther, who nailed his 95 Theses to the door of, I don't know the church that it was, but nailed it to the door of the church and sort of initiated the Protestant movement. Okay. When he did that, he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Here I stand, I can do no other. And Dennett says, let's imagine that's true. Imagine, well, this part in particular, imagine this is true. Imagine that because of his background, because of his character, because of who he is, because of the way he is, Martin Luther couldn't have done anything else. His convictions, his beliefs, his knowledge about the church and his arguments that he was giving, that he formulated with the conclusion that things needed to change. We needed to do things a little differently. Because of all that, let's suppose that he couldn't do anything other than nail his 95 Theses to the door of the church. Okay. Well, Dennett thinks, look, we want our background to determine our actions. We want our character, our background, the way that we are, who we are. We want that to be at least really, really influential over what we do, right? We don't want to be just acting out of character all the time and having our beliefs and our values and our upbringing and the way that our characters were formed and our character itself after having been formed. We don't want this stuff to be independent of what we do. We want that stuff to determine what we do. And even when we hold people responsible, Dennett thinks it doesn't matter that what they did was the result, even the determined result of their character. We actually like that, right? Sorry, here. So Luther's character, we might assume, determined that he would nail the 95 Theses to the church door. He literally couldn't do anything else given who he was, right? Given who and how he was. But Dennett says, that seems good. Doesn't that show that it was really him who was acting? Right? That's kind of this initial motivation. Don't we want our background, our upbringing, our character, our values, all these things about us, who we are and how we are? Don't we want that to determine our actions and not make it so that we could totally act differently? Right? That's going to show us that the action's truly ours. Right? And now, if you just apply that to all of our actions, right? That we, not only that we couldn't do otherwise for this action, but we can never do otherwise. Every time we act, it's completely determined by our character and who we are. Well, then every time we act, we're going to be responsible because it truly reflects ourselves. So if we apply this broadly, then we just say, look, we are morally responsible for what we do only if it truly reflects our true nature, our true character, our true self, right? And what could guarantee reflecting our true character more than our actions being determined by our characters? This kind of deterministic self-determination. Our actions are determined by ourself, right? We cause them, we do them, but in a deterministic way to where it's self-determined to the fullest. We couldn't do anything else, right? What could guarantee that our actions are truly our own, truly reflect our upbringing, character, selves, who we are, other than, what could guarantee that more than our actions being determined by our characters, right? Okay, well, let's see a reply to this. Not so sure if this initial motivation is going to be so motivating. The question is, are we morally responsible for being the way we are? Now, this is going to bring us back to Strawson's basic argument. Pereboom's sort of underlying principle in his manipulation argument that says, look, if you need to be the proper source of your actions. If who you are, what you are, right, the things that make you act the way you do, and just call that who you are and how you are, if that is determined by factors completely outside of your control, then are you really responsible for what you did? Because it doesn't seem like you're responsible for how you are. Okay, remember Strawson's two assumptions. What we do is partly the result, often probably large part, the result of how we are. And therefore, this other assumption, well then, in order to be responsible for what you do, you need to be responsible for how you are. Because if you're not, then your actions are just going to result from how you are, and how you are was not even up to you. You have no control over the kind of person you are and the kind of character you have. But the kind of person you are and the kind of character you have is supposed to be determining your actions, according to Dennett. We're supposed to be okay with that. But you don't pick who you are, right? You don't pick your upbringing. You don't pick your genes. You might say at some point you start having control over who you are, but that's another story. Our question is, are you responsible for the way you are? And if determinism is true, it's not clear how you could be. So consider someone who's determined the other way. They have an evil character, right? Martin Luther, his decision was, not evil. We can think about people doing things that maybe even seem admirable or praiseworthy. And think like, yes, that really shows their character. I think Dennett's example that Kane mentions is, Dennett says, I'm pretty sure he says, I'm confident that it's impossible for me to accept money to torture an innocent person. In particular, $100. Let's just say it's $100. Dennett says, I literally couldn't torture an innocent person for $100. I couldn't do it. It's impossible for me to choose to do that, right? Of course, someone could manipulate me or brainwash me or move me around physically, but I couldn't choose to do that. And Dennett says, that's good. That says something about me. I think I'm kind of praiseworthy for that, right? And when I choose not to, you should say, hey, good job, praiseworthy, right? That flowed from your character, shows us your true self, that you're not the kind of person that would do that. But now imagine an evil person who didn't choose his character, right? It was a terrible upbringing, whatever. Remember Frankenstein's monster. Frankenstein is just created with a character, and let's suppose it's an evil character, and that his evil character determines his evil actions. Is he responsible for that? Well, only if he chose his evil character. Only if he's responsible for the way he is. Because look, the way he is determining. No other alternatives. Determines what he does. So doesn't he need to be responsible for the way he is, if the way he is determining what he does? And so it doesn't really seem like this initial motivation could do enough. Without inserting some ability to control how we are, it's really unclear how what you do can be something you're responsible for if it's deterministically flowing from you. And even if it wasn't deterministically flowing from you, even if it was, maybe the way that your character is doesn't determine one action, but it determines that you're going to do one of two different actions, right? So it's still undetermined what you'll do. Maybe you'll do A or B, right? But what if your character says, there's no way you're going to do C or D because of your character. You could only do A or B. So not determined, but did you pick your character and make it so that you could never do C or D and only you could do A or B? Well, no. And if not, then how could you be responsible without some ability to control either what we are or what we do if it's indeterministic? So this initial motivation seems slightly unmotivating, you might think. Okay, so maybe this doesn't really work, right? Deterministic self-determination, right? Our characters determining our actions. Maybe Dennett's right that this can seem sort of intuitive at first. That's a little unclear as well. But ultimately, it seems like unless we're responsible in some way, control some way how we are, then just having our characters determine what we do is not going to be enough reason to think that someone's responsible. And therefore, it's not enough to show that PAP is false. It's not enough to show that you can be responsible without having the ability to do otherwise. Okay, what's another reason? Well, the second reason to reject PAP is the one that we'll focus on for the rest of the lecture and focus on sort of more centrally. And that is Frankfurt style cases. Okay, this is a much more common way to reject PAP, to reject the idea that moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. So what is a Frankfurt case? In order to see what a Frankfurt case is, the structure of the Frankfurt case, it's probably helpful, and Kane does this. This is not my idea, but I think Kane does a helpful thing here where he says, look, consider first, because considering this first case will show us an important feature of the Frankfurt case. So we'll look at a different kind of case first. Let me see if I can get all that in there. Yep. All right. Consider a similar case. It's importantly different, but it's similar in certain ways. Okay, so John Locke proposed this idea that people could be free even though they can't do otherwise. Okay. He says, imagine somebody's in a room. The room is locked. There's a door, but it's locked. But it's secretly locked, right? You can't open it. There's no key. You can't break it down, whatever. So you can't actually get out of the room, right? Okay, you can't actually get out of the room, even if you tried. Right? But then suppose this person's sitting here, right? And they're lounging, they're chilling. They don't want to go anywhere. And they choose, you know what? I think I'm going to stay in this room. They think about leaving. They have no idea the door is locked, barricaded, can't get through it. They're like, gosh, maybe I should leave. But, they're watching Game of Thrones or something, and how could you get up and leave when Game of Thrones is on? So he says, I think I'll just stay here a while, and decides to stay in the room. Right? Locke says, well, look, it seems like he decided on his own free will, or of his own volition, to stay in the room, even though they couldn't leave the room, even if he tried, right? But in fact, he just decided to stay on his own in the room, right? Now, the important difference here is that this person actually does have an alternative possibility, right? They can get up and go and try to leave the room. They can go try to open the door, right? Nobody's stopping them. They could do that if they want. And they didn't. So there is still a kind of alternative possibility here. And why that's relevant is Locke says this person is free, and probably would say that they're morally responsible for this decision to stay in the room. But that doesn't mean yet that Papp is false. Why? Because Papp says persons are morally responsible only if they could have done otherwise. So responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Well, and freedom requires the ability to do otherwise. And Locke says, well, look, they can't get out, but they decided on their own. It looks like their choice is free and responsible. Well, it's like, well, yeah, but they could have tried something else. They wouldn't have succeeded, right? They would have went up to the door, turned the handle, and be like, what the heck? I'm locked in here. But that's a different choice, right? They could have not chosen to stay. They could have chosen to get up and try to leave, right? That's a different choice. And so this kind of example, while sort of one of the seminal sort of cases to start this push against Papp, Papp, that terminology, this sort of principle wasn't really around yet, but this idea that freedom and responsibility requires the ability to otherwise was certainly around. And John Locke tried to say, I don't think you need alternative possibilities to be free because, look, this guy can't really get out of the room, but even though he can't get out of the room, he can freely stay in the room by just deciding on his own and not trying to get out of the room. But the point here is that, well, he still had another possibility. He could have tried to get out. And that other possibility is what is at least partially what grounds or justifies us saying that he's free in deciding to stay. Okay, because he had that alternative possibility to try to get out. All right. Now, the structure, sorry, excuse my coughing and throat stuff here. The structure of Frankfurt's example, updated example, it kind of changes things a little bit, but we'll see the structure of the Frankfurt example here. Basically what it is hypothetical case, kind of like this, just hypothetical scenario where you come up with some example where some agent performs an action and all of these features are supposed to be true. Okay, these 5 features, at least, are supposed to be true. Now, this is my doing here. I'm sort of pulled these out. Kane doesn't really split it up this way, but hopefully this is kind of a helpful way of understanding the basic structure of the Frankfurt case. And he goes on, he talks about different kinds of examples and versions and different modifications that people make. And we'll talk about some of that. But these 5 features, and they can get described in different ways. I mean, you could probably boil this down into like 3 if you wanted to. You can kind of combine some of them. But I want to pull out sort of these main features. In a Frankfurt example, you have an agent that's deliberating about whether to do some action. Okay, they're thinking, they're about to decide thinking about choosing some action or not. Okay, whether or not to do some action A. Okay. Also, the agent could not have chosen anything other than A. Okay. So they're deliberating about whether to do A, and of course they don't know whether they have they don't know that they can only do A. That's part of it. But the agent's deliberating about whether to do A, but also it's true, and this is important, that's why it's highlighted in green, the agent could not choose anything other than A. That has to be part of the feature. Part of the example. That has to be a feature of the Frankfurt case in order to be a Frankfurt case. Now this green line here, the agent couldn't do anything other than A, that too is true because there's a counterfactual intervener. So Frankfurt cases have what are called counterfactual interveners. That is someone, it's counterfactual because they do not actually intervene. Okay, they don't actually intervene and do anything to the person in the Frankfurt case. But they're there because they would have intervened if the agent would have done something. Okay, so it's somebody, usually it's like a neuroscientist or somebody, it's always an evil neuroscientist. Someone is positioned, they're in a situation such that were the agent about to try to choose not to do A, they're about to try to choose not to do A, then the intervener would act. They would intervene and make them choose A. Okay, so you have an agent, they're deciding whether they're going to do A or not, and then it's true that the agent couldn't do anything other than A, but that's true because there's this counterfactual intervener who would jump in and intervene, kind of secretly usually, and make the person do A if they were about to try to do not A. If they were about to try to choose not to do A, the intervener would do something, hit a button, mess with their brain, do something to make them choose to make them choose A. Right? So there's a counterfactual intervener here, and that counterfactual intervener makes it true that the agent can't do anything other than A. Because look, if they try to do A, the counterfactual intervener is going to intervene, and he's going to make them do A. Right? But the agent chooses to do A on their own. Okay? Counterfactual intervener does nothing. That is also true in a Frankfurt case. Counterfactual intervener himself does nothing to the person. He doesn't force them to do it. Okay. He would force them if they tried to do something else, but the agent chooses to do A on their own. And so the counterfactual intervener does nothing. And the last feature, supposed feature of the Frankfurt case is that the agent is morally responsible for what they did. Okay. So you have an agent thinking about whether to do A. You have a counterfactual intervener, okay, who's going to make them do A if they try not to, or if they're about to try not to. And that makes it true that they can't do anything other than A. Okay. But lo and behold, the agent does A on their own without the intervener doing anything. And the conclusion is supposed to be, this is not the conclusion. There's also a judgment that the agent is responsible for what they do, partly because sort of a conclusion. I mean, that's the idea is that they're responsible because they chose it on their own. Okay, and we'll talk about that actually in just a second. And so the agent is responsible, and then the conclusion, because of this and this, 2 and 5 together, the agent could not have done anything other than A, but the agent is morally responsible for A. And hopefully you know the answer to this question. What does that mean? Well, it means PAP is false. Because PAP says responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. But this Frankfurt case is supposed to have these two features. The person's responsible, but they couldn't have done otherwise. They couldn't have done anything but A. But they're supposed to be responsible for A. Right? Partly because they did it on their own. This is true partly because the counterfactual intervener, maybe fully. But okay, let's look at this in a picture. Now, the setup, this is again just the setup. This is the structure. This is how a Frankfurt case is supposed to work. you have an agent here who's thinking about whether to do some action. Let's say vote Democrat or Republican. Let's say there's only two choices. They're thinking about whether they should do A or B, and let's call this A, voting Democrat. Now, there's this counterfactual intervener here, this neuroscientist who has done something to the agent or knows something about the agent, has like some really powerful knowledge or some powerful mechanism or something like that, to where if the agent were about to try to decide otherwise, then this little thing here, there would be some signal to the neuroscientists that would indicate to them, that would show, right? The neuroscientist is sitting here, the intervener, the counterfactual intervener, is sitting here watching the agent deliberate, and he has some special knowledge and some special technology, so that if the agent were about to try to decide otherwise, then this signal would come up. Maybe they blush right before they're about to decide to do otherwise, or maybe they, what does they say? Furrow their brow, right? They're like eyebrow moves or something, or maybe there's just a little chip in there and it like gives them a signal. It detects the brain processes that are that indicate he's going to try to do something else, and then because of that, the counterfactual intervener really wants this person to do A, to vote Democrat. If the agent were about to try to do otherwise, then the neuroscientist device would kick in. He would press a button, or if there's a chip in there, it would kick in or whatever. And so note that the agent never actually really gets to try to do otherwise in a Frankfurt case. It's not, that's where the difference is, right? It's not like this, where the person could get up and walk around and try and like bang on the door and try to find a key or whatever, because there's no counterfactual intervener here. That's the kind of important difference that Frankfurt kind of very cleverly improved Locke's case by adding this counterfactual intervener. Well, what does that do? It's supposed to give you this alternative possibility. Well, kind of. It gives you this sort of counterfactual possibility, at least. It gives you this idea where it seems like the agent could have tried, but if they would have tried, they wouldn't actually have gotten to try, because if they were about to try, there would be some signal that they were about to try to do otherwise. The neuroscientist would say, no, you're going to vote Democrat, kick their device in, and the neuroscientist would have diverted their choice away from trying to do otherwise and made it so that they chose Democrat. Okay. So if they were about to try to do otherwise, then they would be forced to do Democrat, to vote Democrat. They'd be forced to do A. Okay. So all this stuff in blue here is a hypothetical or a possibility, right? It doesn't actually happen. It's the path not taken. This is what would happen. They would be forced to do A by the neuroscientist or by the neuroscientist's device if they were about to try to decide otherwise. But in the green is the actual scenario, green for go. This is what happens. The agent just decides on their own to vote Democrat. They don't try to do otherwise. They're not even about to try to do otherwise. They simply want to vote Democrat, and they do. And so the counterfactual intervener doesn't actually intervene. Okay, so let me try that again very quickly and sort of summary-like. Here's an agent thinking about whether to do A. If they would try to do something else, if they're about to try to do something else, this little guy over here would step in and force them to do that thing anyways. Okay, but none of that happens. The agent simply decides on their own. And so you can see that the agent is going to do this no matter what. They decide on their own, or if something else happens and they are about to try to do something else, they're going to just do this. So the idea is they can't do anything other than vote Democrat in this situation. However, they decide to do it on their own, and this person does nothing, and therefore Frankfurt thinks this person decides to vote Democrat freely. And, importantly, they are responsible for deciding to vote Democrat because they decided on their own, and none of this other stuff up here had to do anything. Okay, that's the structure of a Frankfurt case. Why is the agent responsible and free? Well, the thought is supposed to be that he chooses or acts for his own reasons, based on his own motivation. It comes from his own character. Nobody's forcing him. right? He just has a bunch of reasons. He's deliberating. Should I do Republican? Okay, maybe I have some reasons. Should I do Democrat? Okay, maybe I have some reasons. What do I want to do? And then decides, I'm just going to vote Democrat. And nobody tinkered with him. Nobody forced him. Nobody did anything, right? They would have. He unbeknownst to him, he couldn't actually vote Republican because there was a neuroscientist lurking in the dark that would have forced him to vote Democrat. But none of that happens. He just chooses on his own, for his own reasons, from his own character. And therefore, now we're kind of pulling back in some of this Dennett stuff. His choice is sort of his own. It was up to him, right? He just decided on his own. And the intervener never has to do anything. That's supposed to be the thought. Now, why does this matter? We're going to just basically pull all that stuff in from the end of the first section. Why does this matter for Pap? Why does this matter for free will? The compatibilism debate? Well, hopefully it's really straightforward why it matters to Pap. Because the idea is this person does not have an alternative possibility. They can't do anything other than this. They either do it on their own, or if they're not going to do it on their own, if there's a signal that they're not going to do it on their own, then they're going to go through this process and be forced to do it. Okay, so they can't do anything other than this, but the way in which they do it sort of suggests that they're responsible for doing it. Therefore, they could be responsible for doing this even though they couldn't have done otherwise. That is why it matters for Pap, because that is just a counterexample to Pap. So we supposedly have a counterexample to Pap, an agent who acts freely and responsibly without having the ability to do otherwise. And Pap is just the view that that's impossible. Pap is the view that you cannot get responsibility, or freedom, really. Responsibility level control. You can't get that without alternative possibilities. It's impossible. That's what the principle says. Okay. But this seems to suggest that the principle is mistaken. Okay. And then there's this other point that, well, look, if that can happen once, why couldn't that happen through our whole entire lives? Just imagine there's a neuroscientist lurking in the dark corners at every moment of your choice. Every choice you make. If you would have tried to choose something else, or if you were about to try to choose something else, that forever neuroscientist, your guardian neuroscientist, would have intervened and made you choose what you actually did. But, in fact, they never had to, because you always chose on your own to do what they wanted you to do. The thought is, why would it matter if it was once or every time you chose something? You get the same result. So it doesn't matter if Frankfurt cases are localized to singular choices, or globalized to every choice that we make. Therefore, determinism, which globally is thought to rule out alternative possibilities, wouldn't matter, because Pap would be false. Okay. And then remember, again, if Pap is false, then AP is false. If this is false, if you don't need alternative possibilities for responsibility, right? If responsibility doesn't require alternative possibilities, then free will doesn't require alternative possibilities. Why? Well, free will is just the control that's needed for responsibility. And we already just said responsibility doesn't require that. So why would the control for responsibility require that? In other words, why would free will require that? Right? So if alternative possibilities aren't needed, this is the ultimate upshot, it's just the same as above. If alternative possibilities aren't needed to be responsible, to be free, then who cares about determinism? Determinism is no longer a threat. And if determinism is no longer a threat to free will and responsibility, that is just compatibilism. That's just the view of compatibilism. Compatibilism says that free will and moral responsibility can still exist in a deterministic world. Okay, they're not inconsistent. And if they're not inconsistent, right, then we just don't have to worry about the truth of determinism. Determinism by itself is not going to rule out freedom and responsibility if alternative possibilities aren't needed. That's the upshot. Okay? Now let's look at a couple responses, or three responses, I should say, few. All right. How have people tried to respond? All right, maybe I should just very quickly again, just remind you of what's going on here. Some agents deliberating. What am I going to do here? Am I going to vote Republican? Am I going to vote Democrat? Am I going to do A or B? The agent can't do anything else, right? They can't do anything else other than this because there's this intervener here that's going to jump in if he needs to, right? The agent can't do otherwise because there's this counterfactual intervener that's going to jump in if he needs to. If the agent is about to try to do something else, he's going to jump in, force him. But he doesn't have to. Right? He doesn't have to. The agent decides on his own. He doesn't about to try something else. He does it on his own. And the agent's responsible. So the thought goes. Because he chooses on his own, acts for his own reasons. Right? So you can be responsible even though you couldn't have done otherwise. That's the thought. Now, what have people said about this? One response that people have given is, hey, I don't know. Maybe there is an alternative possibility there. I mean, you're telling me that he can't do anything other than vote Democrat. That seems right. Okay, that seems right, I guess, because if he tries to do something else, this guy's just going to force him to do that. All right. But why isn't this just like the room case? Why isn't about to trying? I don't know if that didn't sound right. Why isn't doing this about to try thing, right? Again, you're not going to be able to try because the neuroscientist is going to see this signal that you're about to try and they're going to jump in. But why? What about the signal, right? You could have done the signal, right? It could have been true that you were about to try and then the intervener comes in. But that didn't happen. You weren't even about to try, right? You decided on your own. Well, then it seems like there's two possibilities here, right? You could decide on your own, or something could happen where you're about to try. You just don't end your deliberation by deciding to vote Democrat. You end your deliberation with this process of being about to try to do something else, about to try to vote Republican. That's different, right? And so some people say, like, maybe there's still an alternative possibility there. You do A on your own, but there was this other possibility of doing A by force. You could have done A a different way. Yeah, sure, you're going to do A both times, but one way you do it is doing A on your own. And another way you do it, the scenario in which you start to try to do something else, you do A by force. That's what you end up doing, right? So the idea is the possible scenario where the intervener comes in and then like force you to do A, that's just a different action. Doing A on your own is different from doing A by force. Something else caused it, right? You made a straightforward choice on your own to do that. In this one, you didn't. You started to do something else, and then the neuroscientist forced you. So don't we have an alternative possibility here? The Frankfurt case was supposed to show that you have responsibility without the ability to do otherwise. But it looks like we do have an alternative possibility. The agent is morally responsible. So this is what you have to say. So the objection is, well, you have another alternative possibility. These are different, right? But then what that means is the agent's responsible for doing A on his own. Sure, we'll agree to that. But it's only because there was an alternative. That's why. And that just means PAP is still true. The responsibility for doing A on their own is grounded, partly at least, by the presence of this alternative. Well, what do Frankfurt defenders say in reply? Well, first, the first thing they say is this whole thing here. As we'll see, there's another reply to this objection. This is a second objection to the Frankfurt case, and this reply down here is roughly going to be able, at least part of it, to reply to this as well, which I'll try to remember to mention. But the sort of main objection, at least the one that Kane discusses, is this is going to be really kind of counterintuitive and maybe even incoherent. So if you said, well, look, fine, you're responsible for doing A on your own. The agent here is responsible for doing this on their own, right? Because that doing A on their own had an alternative. So it's doing A on their own that they're responsible for, as opposed to, doing A by force, which they wouldn't have been responsible for. Well, if you say that, you get this weird result. Since there's no alternative to doing A itself, just to doing A, right? Forget these little added descriptions. You're going to do A. You're going to do it in one way or you're going to do it in another way. But you're going to do A. But since there's no alternative to doing A, the agent is not responsible for doing A by itself. A itself. Just A, right? So if maybe you're responsible for voting Democrat on your own, but you wouldn't be responsible for just voting Democrat. But then this would be true. The agent is morally responsible for doing A on his own, but not for doing A. The agent is responsible for voting Democrat on their own, but not responsible for voting Democrat at the same time. Those are true at the same time. This whole thing is true, right? This is true. This is true. And this is true at the same time. Okay. This just means and. So these are both true. That sounds pretty incoherent. How could you be responsible for voting for Democrat on your own if you're not responsible for voting Democrat? How can you be responsible for doing something in a certain way if you're not responsible for doing that thing? That just sounds, it doesn't just sound weird. It doesn't just sound counterintuitive. That would kind of be a problem if it sounded counterintuitive. It would be less of a problem, but it would still be kind of a problem. It just sounds very weird. It sounds like something we don't want to accept, but it actually sounds incoherent. It just doesn't make any sense to say, I'm responsible for running quickly, but I'm not responsible for running. I'm responsible for voting Democrat on my own, but I'm not responsible for voting Democrat. It just sounds basically incoherent. And so this objection that there's an alternative possibility there seems to get off the ground a little bit. It's a little, it seems intuitive. Hey, maybe there is this alternative here. But that can't be the right one. The alternative is not A on his own versus A by force. Because if it is, then you get this weird result where you're responsible for doing something on your own without being responsible for doing that thing. It just sounds very weird. So that objection maybe doesn't work. Second objection is very similar. It's at least similar structurally. So it also talks about a possibility. It says like, oh, hey, okay, maybe that's right. Maybe it's not A on your own versus A by force, but maybe the agent had a different possibility. The agent could have started to try not to do A, right? So we still kind of focus, this is why it's very similar. You still focus here on this different alternative, but you don't try to split up the action into doing A on your own versus doing A by force. What you say is just, okay, the agent decides on their own to do A, but look, they could have done something else. That's it. You just end it there, right? Like they could have done something else. They could have started to try to do B, right? Just like this. The person could have got up and tried, right? That's an alternative. But why can't we have, even though you don't get all the way to trying, they could have still done something else. They could have started to try. And that's something. So why can't we say that? The agent had another alternative possibility, different from this one, at least described differently or explained differently. What is the alternative? He could have started to try to do not A. Started to try to not do A. Right? So the objection says there's indeterminism here. There's indeterminism in the prior signal. The intervener is like watching for this signal that he's going to start to try to do A. But that initial situation right here, where they're deliberating, there's indeterminism. He could start to try to do A, could not. Looking for this signal is indeterministic, right? It, in fact, doesn't happen, but it could happen. And so you have this indeterminism. You have this alternative possibility, right? Now, that means the agent could have exhibited the signal that they would not do A. They could have done that. That's the indeterminism. They could have exhibited some signal that they were about to try to not do A, which would have caused the intervention, right? They didn't do that, but they could have. Thus, it follows that if you think responsibility is present here, sure, maybe they're responsible, but only because of this alternative possibility. Right? So we try to save Pap that way. They say, fine, the agent is responsible for deciding on their own, but it's because you have this indeterminism right here. You have this alternative possibility. And maybe you guys were even thinking of that before as I was describing this. Like, wait, why is there no alternative? I get like, okay, fine. You're going to end up doing the same thing, but there is this alternative thing that could have happened here, right? You could have taken a different path. And why isn't that just what we mean by path? More responsibility requires this ability to have taken another path. And it does seem like you get that. Okay, what do people say in response? Well, this response here is roughly this John Martin Fisher response that invokes what's called flickers of freedom. So the reply is, look, exhibiting that signal, that indeterminism here, whether or not you exhibit this signal that you're about to try to do otherwise, that you're about to try to do B, whether or not that happens, whether you blush, whatever the signal is, if you blush or your eyebrow moves or your neurons start to do another process, whatever that is, either it's voluntary or it's involuntary. It's got to be one of them. Either you sort of do it on purpose, you initiate the signal that you're about to do B, you initiate that on purpose, or you don't do it on purpose. It's like an involuntary tick, right? You just blush, or you just have a little tick in your eyebrow moves, or like a random fluctuation in your neurons. Okay, two options. Either it's voluntary or not. And the reply is, none of those is going to help the objector. If exhibiting the signal is voluntary, then we just ask, well, was that free? And we can just do the Frankfurt case on that voluntary decision to issue the signal. We can just make it so that the counterfactual intervener is focused on this sort of signal decision. So they want you to not show the signal. And so then we have just another kind of intervention thing going on here where, okay, they make it so that you could try to not do the signal, but if you try to not do the signal, then they'll force you to not do the signal. You just get the same setup, but you just push it back. Instead of asking about the decision to do this, we're asking about the decision to make the signal or not. So we can just push this all back. So that doesn't really help. Right? It doesn't get you out of the structure of the Frankfurt case. The voluntary decision just becomes the focus. And we start the Frankfurt case all over again, and we could set it up on that decision. And then that decision would be one for which you could have alternative possibilities. You could voluntarily do the signal, but you don't. You just decide not to do it on your own, right? You just get the same thing. Now, here's a question. Kane doesn't talk about this, but why? So it's not really clear. Let me see if I can change this real quick. Let's do blue. The idea here is this reply is supposed to get after this, right? Here's an objection. Hey, you have another alternative possibility. That's why you're responsible. Therefore, PAP is still true. And they're like, wait a minute. Well, was your alternative possibility voluntary? Because if it was voluntary, then we can just shift the Frankfurt case back. And we can focus the Frankfurt case on your voluntary decision to exhibit that signal. Why can't we just shift the objection back then? Right? Why can't we just start the objection all over again and say, all right, well, how does the neuroscientist know that you're going to shift this, exhibit the signal? Well, there must be some other signal, right? So it's just not going to get us anywhere. You might think, well, it doesn't get the objector anywhere either, because then we can just do this reply again, and then we just keep going in circles, right? Well, if we just keep going in circles, then what we started with was the Frankfurt case, and then we raised this objection. Hey, there's an alternative possibility. right? That's why this doesn't work. The Frankfurt case is supposed to show that you're responsible even though you couldn't do otherwise. I was like, well, you could do otherwise. You could do it right here. Right? That's the objection. So PAP is true because you could still do otherwise. I was like, oh, well, wait. Is it voluntary? Then we could shift it back. Well, fine. Then we'll just shift the objection back. Right? What's the signal for the signal? Is that then you had an alternative possibility there, right? So just because we can keep going in circles doesn't mean that it doesn't support either decision. It looks like the Frankfurt case was posed and this objection seems to get after it. But if this reply leads to a kind of a circle, I don't see why we don't just come back to this objection. Okay, but this is sort of the more, I don't know, I guess the more sort of popular way of responding, or the part of the response that people focus on more. So again, the objection is this whole setup here doesn't work because even if you're responsible for this, it's only going to be because you could have done something else here. You could have started to try, right? You could have initiated this signal. You could have blushed, right? Or your neurons could have done something else. And you could have been about to try to do something else. And that's different than just the agent doing the decision on their own. Well, if it's involuntary, right? If it's like a tick, a blush, if you just oh, well, you could have done something different because you could have just blushed, right? And you didn't blush, but you could have blushed. Well, it's but that's involuntary, right? That's just like an involuntary movement. Blushing, your eyebrow moving, your neuron firing. And that kind of alternative is not enough. It's irrelevant. We don't care if you could do some involuntary movement. That's not what we care about. When PAP says, hey, responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, they don't mean responsibility requires the ability to randomly fire a neuron or randomly have your face tick. Hey, no. That would be what John Fisher calls just a flicker of freedom. It's not enough. That little flicker of the possibility of blushing or the possibility of your eyebrow twitching, that's not enough to make you responsible for something. Okay. So PAP, the idea that responsibility requires the alternative possibility, right? PAP says responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Well, the ability to do otherwise needs to be much more genuine, much more robust than some involuntary tick. Okay, so if that's true, if PAP requires a more robust alternative, like the ability to actually decide to do something different, then PAP would still be false. PAP still fails to be true. There is no robust alternative. Okay, so let me do this objection here, and then this part of the reply again with the picture. Okay, so again, the setup is here's a person deliberating. Here's this counterfactual intervener who's going to do all this stuff if he needs to. And the counterfactual intervener and all this stuff, it makes it so this is always going to happen, right? This is the setup of the Frankfurt case again. Here's a person. They can't do anything except for this because of this guy and his nonsense up here. But hey, none of this nonsense does anything. He doesn't have to do anything. He just stands by and reads a book. He doesn't have to intervene. Why? Because the agent decides on their own, right? And because the agent decides on their own, it looks like they're responsible for this, even though they couldn't have done otherwise. That's the Frankfurt example. Now, the objection was, wait a minute, they can do otherwise. So the objection is not that they're not responsible, right? The objection is, fine, if you want to say they're responsible, that's fine, but it's because they could have done otherwise. They could have tried to do something else, or they could have started to try to do something else. Therefore, PAP is not false, right? The objection to Frankfurt cases says, you have not shown that PAP is false. You have not shown that someone's responsible even though they couldn't do otherwise. Because look, they could do otherwise. So that's the objection. Okay? Now the response is this ability to do otherwise right here is irrelevant. It's not enough. You can't just have the ability to do otherwise be an involuntary tick. Now remember, the signal is supposed to be like a blush or a eyebrow twitch, and that's going to let the neuroscientist know what you're about to do. Okay, this would be trying to do something else, like forming an intention to vote Republican or starting to try to like walk over to the door. That's a more robust alternative, right? Having that kind of alternative would be able to make you responsible for this. But just twitching your eyebrow, that's not enough. That's not a sort of quote-unquote robust alternative. That's merely a flicker of freedom. A flicker of freedom. We want more freedom than that. This freedom to do something else can't just be this little flicker where you have this little twitch. It was possible that you twitched your eye. You didn't twitch your eye and you just went over here, but it was possible that you twitched your eye. Like, who cares if it was possible that you twitched your eye? That's not enough. That's not enough to make you responsible, right? So even though that little insignificant alternative possibility exists, that's not what's grounding responsibility. It's not enough to ground responsibility. So you have responsibility here, right? But you don't have a robust alternative grounding it. That little possible twitch here is just like out of the picture. We don't even care about that. What makes the person responsible is like being caused by their character and doing it on their own and all this stuff, not the little twitchy thing here. Therefore, PAP, the idea that responsibility requires alternative possibilities, is false, because the alternative possibility that's here, that's not what PAP is talking about. PAP's talking about a more robust alternative, like being able to decide to do something different. But you don't have that. You can't get there. You can't get here. Because all you can get to is this little twitch, and then the neuroscientist is going to jump in. But that twitch that's not really an alternative possibility. That's basically the idea. You could do this like exaggerated really. Is PAP true? The Frankfurt person is trying to say, no, it's not true, because you don't really have an alternative possibility. Right? Maybe the agent has a different alternative. They could have started to try. Well, what's starting to try? It's like this involuntary flick of your eyebrow, or involuntarily blushing, or something like that. And the reply here to this objection says, that's not really an alternative. So PAP's still false. There's no alternatives here. There's no robust alternatives. And yet the person's still responsible. Right. Okay. That's the second objection. And that's the reply. That's not really an alternative. That's merely a flicker of freedom. All right. Yeah, underestimated how much talking would mess my throat up. Sorry about that. Whew, okay. Frankfurt-style cases will not work unless we presuppose compatibilism. That is the next objection. So this final objection says, and this is what Kane thinks anyways, is, and I guess kind of more accepted, that this is kind of a more serious objection. Okay. More serious in the sense like it's more plausible, it has more bite to it, this objection. Okay. And the objection says the Frankfurt case already presupposes compatibilism. Another way to put that is, I should say, that PAP is false. Kind of the same thing here. I hope that didn't mess up my, no, I don't have any pictures. There you go. So the Frankfurt case, this objection says, it doesn't work unless we already presuppose that compatibilism is true. In other words, unless we already presuppose that PAP is false. But it's supposed to show us that PAP is false. The Frankfurt case is supposed to be evidence that PAP is false. It can't presuppose it from the beginning. It's supposed to be evidence that compatibilism is true. That you can be free and responsible even though determinism is true. That you can be free and responsible even though you couldn't do otherwise. It's supposed to show us that. It's supposed to lead us there. But this objection says it doesn't lead us there. It starts there. It already presupposes that before it gets off the ground. Okay, why does it say that? It says the objection goes, look, the action here, this action, right, up until the moment of choice, right, so the choice that gets made right here, and this action, but really the choice that gets made right here has to be undetermined. It has to be undetermined. Whether or not you do A, whether or not the agent votes Democrat, that cannot be determined. It has to be undetermined up to the moment of choice. Okay? So if it's undetermined, then if it's truly undetermined, right, could be either one. Could do Republican, could do Democrat, could do A, could do B. If it's really undetermined, then the intervener, that little guy hanging out, he cannot really know what like this signal is going to be, or that this signal will make the person do the other action. Right? He can't really know that. That signal cannot really tell him what's going to happen. Maybe he'll have evidence that it's going to happen. Maybe it's like, oh, that I should believe that it's going to be likely that it will happen. But if it's really undetermined, he can't actually know that the signal means he's going to vote Republican. Because then it wouldn't be undetermined. Right? Now, if it's undetermined, if the action is undetermined up to the moment of choice, then the intervener cannot really know what the agent's going to do. Okay, he can't really know what the agent's going to do. All right. Now, if he can't really know, then he's got a choice. Does he intervene or not? If he doesn't intervene before the choice, then the agent's morally responsible because there was another possibility. It was truly undetermined whether he was going to vote Republican, or whether he was going to vote Democrat. So he can be responsible for voting Democrat, but only because the agent had another possibility. A truly undetermined possibility. The intervener cannot wait. That's kind of the point here. The intervener can't wait for the signal. Because once the signal happens, then he's going to intervene and is going to force it, and he's not responsible. And if he waits and the agent decides to do it, right, he doesn't know. He can't know beforehand because it's truly undetermined. So he can't wait. He can't wait. And so he has a choice. He's got to intervene before this decision, right? But if he doesn't intervene before that decision, then the agent can be responsible, but only because there was another possibility. If he does intervene to make sure the agent does A, because remember, he can't know because it's undetermined, then the agent's not responsible, right? Because he would have been forced. It would just be like waiting for the signal. But he can't wait for the signal. The neuroscientist can't wait for the signal. Why? Because the choice really has to be undetermined. And if it's really undetermined, what the hell does he know? He can't wait. If he waits, then who knows what's going to happen, right? If he just waits. Now, either way, if he doesn't intervene, the agent's responsible, but there is an alternative. If he does intervene, then the agent's just not responsible because he was forced. So either way, PAP, the idea that moral responsibility requires alternatives, ends up surviving. It's unaffected. Because you get responsibility here, but you do get alternatives. And here you don't even get responsibility, so we don't even have to ask the question. Right, so PAP is unaffected. Now, why think it has to be undetermined? Right? The action must be undetermined. Why think that? Well, consider the alternative. Suppose the agent's choice is determined, right? It's not undetermined. It is determined. Well, then, this is the presupposing part. If it's determined, then to say that the agent is responsible just already presupposes compatibilism. Well, he's determined. He doesn't have any alternative possibilities, right? If the choice to do A, if this choice down here is determined, then we already have our answer to PAP. This can't tell us anything. The Frankfurt case doesn't show us that PAP is true. It presupposes that PAP is true. If this is determined, It can't show us that PAP is false. It has to presuppose that it's false. Because if this is determined, then the agent can't do otherwise. And then to say he's responsible requires PAP to be false and compatibilism to be true. But if this is not determined, like it's supposed to not be here, that's why the signal stuff is here, because they don't want this to be determined. But if it's not determined, then the neuroscientist can't really wait because he doesn't know what's going to happen. And if he doesn't know what's going to happen, he needs to intervene. He needs to intervene, right? But then that would be forcing. Now, the reply to this, what he calls, Kane calls the indeterminist world objection. So the Frankfurt case needs to happen in an indeterministic world. But if it does that, then either PAP is going to be unaffected, or the Frankfurt case just presupposes that PAP is false, instead of showing us that PAP is false. Now the reply, and Kane kind of goes off on this, and we're not going to talk very much about all the nitty-gritty details here and all these little crazy modifications on the Frankfurt case, but basically the reply is just to modify the Frankfurt case. Okay, how? Well, you modify the Frankfurt case so that you get indeterminism, right? You kind of embrace the objection. You're like, okay, I see, it does have to be undetermined. So you modify the Frankfurt case so the choice, or the process leading to it, is undetermined, but where the agent is still blocked from the action. Why? Because you need it to be true. The Frankfurt case needs it to be true that the agent could not have chosen anything other than A. Right? So they can't do anything but this, right? Either they do it on their own or they get forced if something else happens. But you need this indeterminism here, or else you presuppose PAP is false. You beg the question, it's called. So the reply then to this objection is to say, all right, I need to make this alternative here, this indeterministic possibility. I need to make this choice undetermined, or at least some process leading up to it, leading up to this choice being undetermined. But I also need to block this alternative. I need to make it so this is the only thing they can do. Okay, so the reply here is modify the Frankfurt case so that the choice, or the process leading to it, is undetermined, but the agent's blocked from performing the alternative actions. And this is going to kind of get us back to a structure that's similar to Locke's locked room case. Imagine that you just lock the door. So the person has two choices they can make. They can go through door A or door B. And the intervener, instead of waiting for a signal, they just go ahead and barricade the door. They barricade door B, lock it up, barricade it. Right? And then the person just chooses A. Right? They just choose A. Or, instead of doing that, a kind of more Frankfurt-y style case that's actually a little bit cleaner, imagine that the intervener puts some blockage in the neural process. So they're deliberating, the agent's deliberating, what should I do? Should I do A or B? And they could start a neural process that will make them choose A, or they could start a neural process that will make them choose B. Okay, so indeterminism, two options here. But the neuroscientist sneaks in beforehand, maybe the night before while the agent is sleeping, and puts a block in their B neural process. The neural process, the neural pathway that would allow them to do B, the neuroscientist puts a little block at the end of that. So they can still engage in this process. It's still undetermined, right? They can still do either process. But if they do the B process, it's going to get blocked at the end. And then they're just going to have no choice but to do A. Right? But they don't do that process. They just choose A. So it looks very similar, but the blockage thing is basically saying the neuroscientist, the intervener, doesn't wait around like this. They're not just sitting, waiting around. They actually come in beforehand and block the other process from being able to unfold. It can start, the other process can start, like the person can start reaching for the door and try the handle, but it ends up being blocked, so they can't do that, right? And the same with if it's just a neural process or something like that, and they're deliberating, they could start another neural process where they're about to decide to do B, decide to vote Republican. But you don't have an intervention at that point. The intervention already took place. The neuroscientist like snuck in beforehand and put a little block in his brain so that if he does this process, this neural process, then it's going to get interrupted and blocked at some point and force him to go back this way. So the main difference is the blockage means the intervention has already happened. It's an intervening case. It's not a counterfactual intervening case. It's a counterfactual blocking case. So the alternative action would be blocked, right? If they tried that, but the intervention has already happened. Okay, they could try it, but it wouldn't work out because the block is there. The intervention already happened. A block is there, so the block is counterfactual. The block doesn't actually occur because the person doesn't try the door, or the person doesn't go for that other neural process in an attempt to choose B. They just choose A on their own. And so it doesn't actually get blocked. Right? Now the question Kane raises is, wait a minute, doesn't it just seem like they're determined to do A? It just seems like they're determined to do A. They're not determined to do A in this way, because they could have done A in this other way, but it seems like they're determined to do A. At least at some point, right? Maybe they're not determined to do A like through this process here. But even right here, before they even decide, before you know which process will unfold, the intervener has already done his work. He's put the little block in, right? And at that point, now it's determined that they'll do A. At least it seems that way, right? Either they're determined, either that's the result, which again begs the question. It just assumes someone can be responsible even though they're determined, right? Because you really don't have alternative possibilities here. Or, okay, fine, if you don't want to say they're determined, because there are two pathways you could take, even though they lead to the same thing. Maybe there's some robust alternative. Maybe the person can decide to start this other neural process. But if it's robust, then that's going to ground more responsibility, and it's going to do it via PAP. So PAP's still going to be true. If there's a robust alternative, that's why they're responsible. And that just means PAP is still true. If it's not robust, if it's just like a flicker, right? So the alternative neural process that you could take, maybe you can't like choose to take it. Maybe it's kind of like this, where it, you don't really get to the trying part, but it's just like a flicker of a neuron or something that could make you do this other neural process. But then the intervener put a block there, and so it's blocked, right? But if the alternative is robust, PAP is true, because now you have a robust alternative, and that's why you're responsible. If it's not robust, if it's a flicker, why can't we just use John Martin Fisher's principle and say that's not enough to ground responsibility? Therefore, they're not responsible. They wouldn't be responsible, right? Because they didn't have a robust alternative. So, again, the reply is, Frankfurt cases seem like they have to presuppose compatibilism. They have to presuppose that PAP is false. They were supposed to lead us there and show us that PAP is false. But they don't. Okay? Now, let's do a little bit takeaway here. All right, so what you need to understand is the connection between these concepts. That's what's really important. Understand these concepts. Okay? What is the relationship? What's the relationship between moral responsibility and free will? We talked about above. Right? Responsible only if you're free. Right? So make sure you know which is required for which, the kind of direction that they go in. Which one is required for the other one? This one for that one. That's the answer. Why does free will get defined in terms of responsibility? Why does it get defined as responsibility level control? It has something to do with this. Okay, just go back over that beginning part, and especially, hopefully, I hope that this helps, that this left side of the first diagram here kind of helps you see the connections. Something is required for something else if it's underneath it. It's required to hold this up. So free will is required for responsibility. PAP means alternative possibilities are required for responsibility. Okay, so try to make sense of those conceptual connections because it will help you see why these are important. PAP, AP. PAP, again, it's just responsibility requires alternative possibilities. AP, free will requires alternative possibilities, right? But why would this rest on that? Why would free will require alternative possibilities? Only because this does. Well, because free will is defined in terms of this. Free will just is the control that this requires. And if this requires this, and this is the control that this requires, then this requires this. Because this is about control. Okay. Now, what do these do for the debate? These seem to make the debate over determinism relevant. If we should care about determinism, it's probably because we care about being able to do otherwise. And so these are important. But if these end up being false, if we don't have to require these in order to get freedom and responsibility, then we don't care about determinism. That's why these are important. That's why these matter to determinism. All right. What are the two ways in which people have tried to reject PAP? Well, there's the character-based one, right? Oh, don't we just want our characters to determine what we do? Because then that means our actions are truly our own, right? And then think about the response to that. And then make sure you understand the basic structure of the Frankfurt case, okay? This here, here, this picture, but these things, these need to be true. This, and this. And 5 and 2 together create PAP being false. Or just, not create, but they create the problem for PAP. Agent is responsible for A. Agent couldn't have done anything other than A. What's PAP? Responsibility requires alternatives. So, that just bugs me. There. Sorry. So the basic structure of the Frankfurt case is really important to get down. You're just not going to understand obviously the replies or how it works, whatever, if you don't understand that basic structure. So look at those 5 points that need to be true about a Frankfurt case. Look at the diagram, try to make sense of it, and email, come to office hours, ask questions if you don't get it. Okay. Think about those features. You have to have a choice for something. You have to have this intervener. The person's responsible. They couldn't do otherwise. And can you explain why that structure shows that PAP is false? Try to explain it to a friend or family member. Okay. Now, and then think about the responses. This is obviously much more important to get down first, this part here. Get that down or you're not going to get this part. So focus on understanding this. Come with questions about this if you have them. And then this stuff will start making more sense. Okay. So why does it matter whether an alternative possibility was present? Why does it matter? Why does it matter whether the agent could have done otherwise? Well, because Frankfurt cases are supposed to show that this is false. They're supposed to show that someone's responsible, but they couldn't do otherwise. And so this would be false. Right? So why does it matter? Why are the people fighting over whether there's an alternative possibility there? That's why. Because PAP. Frankfurt cases are supposed to destroy PAP. And they destroy PAP only if the person's responsible and there was no alternative. And so that's why it matters whether there's an alternative. Now, what does it mean for it to be robust or a flicker? Think about that. When people say, oh, okay, fine. There is an alternative, but it's only a flicker of freedom. It's not robust. What do they mean by that? Think about that. Now, focus on the last objection mostly, because that's the sort of more important one. And the dialectic in particular, right? So the dialectic meaning the way in which the conversation goes back and forth. Who has the burden of proof? Right? The objection, that third objection, is basically saying, hey, that's not fair. You can't say that Pap is false because of the Frankfurt case. We already have to think Pap is true in order for the Frankfurt case to work. Okay. Why? That's kind of the answer. Why do they have to say it's undetermined? Why does the objector say, hey, the choice in the Frankfurt case, that better be undetermined? Why do they say that? Because it would beg the question. If it's determined, then we already have to think Pap is false in order for the person to be responsible, because they don't have any alternatives. So you need alternatives in order for the Frankfurt case to do what it's supposed to do. Show that there's responsibility without alternatives. In other words, destroy Pap. Okay. So what does the Frankfurt case defender do in response? They need to modify. They say, can an action be undetermined even though the relevant alternatives are blocked? Does that even make sense? Remember Kane's questions like, it just seems like it's determined. I mean, if there's a block there, it just seems like it's determined. You can't really do something else. You can try, I guess, but even before you try, it's determined that you're going to do A. I don't care what path you take. You're going to do A. That's determined. So if you're responsible for A and you can't do anything other than A, okay, Pap's going to be false. But if it's determined that you're going to do it from the beginning of the case, then you've already begged the question. So they need to be able to say that it's undetermined and block the alternatives. Can they do that? That's the question. And if they can, is the indeterminism that they introduce, is it enough? Is it enough for responsibility? Because Pap is false only if the agent's responsible and they couldn't do otherwise. Okay. That indeterminism, remember, if this indeterminism here is like a little twitch, is that really enough to say that they're responsible? All right, so that's the Frankfurt cases. The next lecture, I think we'll talk about, what was this? This was chapter 8 of the introduction, contemporary introduction. And the next one we're going to go to is chapter 10, which focuses on the reactive attitudes conception of responsibility that was put forward by Peter Strawson. So we've seen Galen Strawson. Let's see if I can find it. We saw Galen Strawson with his basic argument. He's an impossibilist. So his dad, Peter Strawson, gave a famous argument for compatibilism that focuses on understanding moral responsibility in terms of these reactive attitudes that we have towards each other. So we'll talk about that next time. Thanks.